Could you tell me the story of how you met, how did you meet Nettie? Because you're cousins.
Nettie,
So you must have known each other anyway,
I knew the family.
because you're a Dalfen.
I worked for your father in Edmonton, New Brunswick, right?
Mm-hmm.
I never
In January, I came into Montreal. He said, "You're going to Montreal, so I'll give you something you should give to my sisters, to Esther." It was on a Sunday. I came up and I brought the thing. Joe sent you this thing. And she was there, and I saw her there.
She
And
was
I thought-
pretty.
And I asked her whether she would like to go to a movie. She said, okay. This was Sunday. I took her out Sunday, and then we went out Monday, and Tuesday we got engaged.
No, but how did you get engaged? You went with Faggy and with a vroom.
I went to a room. They told me about her 4 years before, 3 years before. She was 16. I didn't want to bother her. She's a kid, wasn't gonna.
Right.
But 3 years after, she was 19 already. So,
No, and then you went to a nightclub, right? You went to a nightclub with Faggy in a room. That was on the third date. And they got up to dance. And then when they came back from dancing, he said, "Kidner Mazel Tov, we got engaged."
She knows what
And my mother said,
Tell that part again.
okay, so they went to a nightclub. They were double dating. Faggy and Avram Dalfen, they were married already. And then my mother and my father, they went forced into a nightclub. And Faggy and Avram got up to dance. And by the time they came back from dancing, my father says, "Give us a muscle tub, we just got engaged." And my mother says, she still hasn't said yes. I still haven't.
The way home from the nightclub, we met Max Dalfen and his wife. So I told Max, hey, give us a mazel tov. She didn't know what the mazel tov was.
So your father, is it your father, was my grandfather's brother?
Yeah.
Right.
Right. And what was your father's name?
Anne.
Aaron. Okay.
And the first was Vincent, Anne, Mendel, and Elia. There were 4 brothers.
Right. Very nice.
Yeah.
Were there any sisters?
I'm sorry?
How many boys, how many girls? Were there girls too? Or just...
One girl. You know, Mariam. One, 4 boys and 1 girl.
Your parents was, of course, that your mum was very sick,
Yeah,
and that he looked after her.
looked after her, and then we had the news that he died.
Hmm.
Mama didn't know, and he had a heart problem, and he went to shul 3 days before Rosh Hashanah. He blew the shofar, and that you're not supposed to when you have a heart problem. And then he came home, and right in front of Shirley, he dropped dead.
Oh my God.
She opened the door
And Mama didn't know anything about it. She couldn't speak because she had a stroke, but she would make like a S for school, you know. So we used to say that we went out to New Brunswick to help the Jew in the store. So that's why he's not here. We couldn't tell her that he
Of course.
died. So that's the
Hard.
That, yeah.
And they were very young. 56 he died, and she was 53, and they died 6 months apart.
And Shirley was
Oh, so
12 years
it was a
old.
love story.
Yeah. And Shirley was
Shirley
orphaned.
was 12 years old when Daddy dropped right in front of her and died.
Hmm.
And then she was about 15,
And you
6 months later.
you were
I
already.
I was there in New Brunswick, but I insisted upon coming here because I wanted a home for Shirley. She didn't have where should she go? I mean, nobody would take her.
But this was in Europe that this happened, right?
No, here.
Oh, it happened here.
On Hutchison.
Oh, goodness gracious! And so your sister Shulika moved in with you?
Yeah, we came here. We came to Montreal. We lived in New Brunswick, and we moved in here, and I had her living with me.
Right. What a nice sister.
I
You're a
was
nice sister.
I was 2. We're 13 years old. So she was 15, and she lived with us until she got married.
Yeah.
You're nice, Nettie.
Not only nice,
You're a very nice, sensitive woman.
she did an awful lot for Shirley. Completely and totally. She was the bubby to her
12
kids.
years old.
Yeah. Yeah.
And my father too, used to come to the store. I'm gonna start crying. I don't want to do this. And he said that Shirley would bring the kids and he would outfit them for school.
Right.
Give them all the clothes every season, every year. And just very close. For him, it wasn't a cousin or a sister-in-law, which she was both, because, my father and Shirley were cousins, and also
a sister-in-law.
But really, it was it was totally blood. It was
love.
It was just love. Love.
Right.
Just love.
And I like seeing this, you learn to be compassionate because I had it in my house.
For my mother, I think the big tragedy of her life was that she basically had only very limited memories of her mother when she was well, and a lot more memories of her mother when she sort of post-stroke and was able to speak or really move around. And I think it was very difficult for her as a child with a parent who was ill.
Sure.
And I think that when she herself became ill at a young age, which is like about 31, she really did not want us to have a life with a parent. She related back to how she felt about it, and so that was really a very sort of cruel twist of life, that she herself became what she was so difficult for her as a child.
Passed away. But don't you think it's interesting that Auntie Esther was, the way I see her from the stories I've heard, she was sort of a woman ahead of her time a little bit. She stepped out of the box. And because I'm sure that not a lot of women at that time were drawing in Chumash books,
Yeah.
for example.
That's
And I know that she
yeah.
read a lot of books. She was very, very well read and very intellectual.
Right.
And Uncle Srul,
Yeah.
your grandfather,
Yeah.
was also a book person.
Right.
And then your mother,
Yeah.
even though she really didn't know her parents that well.
She actually reflected those qualities. It's very true. And of course, the most important element of the story is really my Auntie Nettie, who, was in every way, shape, and form a mother to my mother. And then subsequently, I sort of definitely the bubby figure for us. She definitely played that role 100%. And yes, I think my mother did step out of the box, and we all got a kick out of it, and particularly Auntie Nettie, whose whole universe was really her baby sister, and she was, everything to her and to us. I mean, has always been, really, really bubby / mother / auntie doesn't just quite describe it at all.
Right.
She's everything. She's made the whole difference in my mother's life and in our lives.
And your mother was a writer?
She wrote. She started writing these little anecdotal columns for a Chicago newspaper. They had a contest, and she actually, you get $50 or $25, I can't remember. It was supposed to be about everyday life. It was in the living section, and she submitted one, it got printed, kept submitting them, and in fact she developed a fan base. And then we made Aliyah when I was 12. They actually carried that, and she submitted columns from Israel describing her experience.
Wow. Which
Which was full of humor in a very difficult time, because it was the Yom Kippur War, and it was a real culture shock to her to all of a sudden find herself in Israeli society, in a war. And so she would take elements of her life there, and she was diagnosed there with multiple sclerosis, so it wasn't a good 2 years. And yet she would relate her experiences in the hospital, the war, and back in Chicago there were readers just clamoring to read what was going on in her life.
Right.
So that was very special. And definitely lots of humor, very artistic, definitely out of the box. So if her mother was, cartooning in the back of her hutch, I could see that this apple not falling
Far from the tree.
Yeah.
I like that.
For sure. Yeah, it's very true. And she actually, what you just showed me, that cartoon is very similar to my mother would constantly draw profiles and silhouettes everywhere. And I do it, like anywhere. You always see these things around my house. It's always like profiles. And that's pretty interesting.
Hi, this is a story now about Sadie. In Romania, every Friday night, Sadie went to shul and always invited poor guests back to the house for dinner. Just happened one Friday evening, there was nobody to invite. He came back home, made kiddush, and sat at the table, and just couldn't eat. It just felt wrong. The children went out looking for poor people to invite back to the home.
I had mentioned how my mother's brother, she was so close to her, she was really close, so close to her sisters, and they all looked alike. They wore same haircut, they had little strudels on their head, and they were so cute, and they did everything together with cards. But I remember Auntie Mary, that is Arnie's mother, and I loved her, and she was a special lady, and she was the president of the Dalfen chapter. And I remember Auntie Clara's house and Auntie Miriam's house and my mother's house, how they were getting ready for the bazaar, and they would collect, and our fathers would go from store to store, and that was a beautiful chesed, a beautiful thing how they did. But here was Auntie Mary, who was, again, like my father, a sister-in-law, but they all loved her. We all loved her. I remember her now. I don't know what year Auntie Mary passed away.
She passed away in 57.
2
years after
what?
we were married.
Okay, but I remember her coming over to the house. I remember her hairdo. She was the president of the Dalfen chapter. That was important, and how all the sisters and brothers raised money for this chapter and collected money and got clothes and so on.
And their house was full of clothes all the time.
I remember my mother-in-law standing on street corners trying to sell raffles for the Dalfen chapter. And already she was a woman who was aged, and she worked like crazy for the bazaar. She'd go in early in the morning, and she'd be there all day, and believe me, she didn't have the strength. Her legs were bad, but she continued. She was a person with a very strong will, and if you asked her if she wasn't feeling well, she was always tip-top shape. She never, you never knew a thought. She would never express the pain. She was a person who was always content, and she liked to do things for everybody.
My father, I wouldn't have done it. My father was once walking to the bank, and he sees a person that looks obviously Jewish walking on St. Francis Street, right near the train station. We dealt with the provincial bank, which is now the National Bank, and he sees this, and he says, my father decides to follow him. He says, he looks Jewish, but I don't know who this guy is. Anyway, he decides he's going to go over and talk to him. The guy's walking towards the train station. My father goes and says, are you Jewish? And he says, yes. He says, so what are you doing here in town? He says, well, I'm collecting money for some Jewish institution. So he says, so why didn't you come to me? So he says, I'm only in town for a half hour. I'm waiting for the train. So my father gave him a donation at the same time. My father would call I went to a Catholic school in Edmundston with nuns and priests, and they were, in those days, there were the orphanages, and the kids were poor. So my father would call the one of the nuns, the head of the nuns, I think it was Sister Julian, and she should send over, she should come with 2 orphans, and my father would dress them for fall, and he'd also dress 2 orphans, and the same 2 for the spring. Anyway, they would come, and my father would dress 2 orphans, and then when my father went on a buying trip to Montreal, my mother would call Sister Julian. She says, "I want to dress 2 orphans too." So we ended up addressing 4 orphans every season. Well, 2 seasons a year.
Very nice.
Very nice.
So,
What I want to say was that I don't have a specific story to say, only that I have a memory of total joy. But maybe a lot of the stories I didn't hear, and there was something a little bit different about my dad compared to the rest of the family. When he was growing up, he was the most indulged that I heard. But to show you the camaraderie in the family, that even though my father didn't abide totally by all the laws of the religion, there was such forgiveness in the family that he was never chastised. They pretended it never happened. They ignored it, and that was part actually of the sedaka of the family. In the same way that my father would leave money in a drawer for his mother, and so she shouldn't be humiliated by receiving charity. That's how charitable this family is. So there's always forgiveness. There's never, nobody is chastised, whether they do something less than perfect. So I think that's memorable about this family.
Okay, I'll add to that.
I'll add to
I'll add
that.
to mine. Another thing, even though your father wasn't religious, he's very well learned.
Oh, I know that.
Extremely
I know that.
well learned.
And religious in his heart.
He was religious. He wasn't observant.
Observant, right.
And here's the thing about Dad also, was that, like Arnie says, he knew his stuff so well even though he wasn't so observant. And one of the biggest memories that I have of my father was that when I was in shul, even though he was in the men's section and he could have been sitting so far away from me that I may not even sometimes have been able to see his face, but I could recognize my father's singing voice. He had such a beautiful voice, and I could hear it through the synagogue, even through other people's voices. It was so recognizable and distinguishable from all the other voices.